Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well and can hear me okay. My name's Henry. I am a business development manager here at NQA. We're here this afternoon for a 45-minute webinar on supplier management. I'm going to start off today with a very quick overview of NQA, who we are and what we do. Then I will be passing you over to Frank, who you can see on your screen, and he will be doing the main part of the webinar. Next page, please, Frank. So yeah, an overview of NQA. As you can see, we're a global certification body. We're actually owned by a large American company called NTS, who are leaders in the testing and inspection industry. We have a large number of standards that we certify to, covering a range of management systems. We've been around for well over 30 years now. We have over 1,000 employees globally, with over 50,000 certificates, which breaks down to just over 100 employees in the UK with 12,000 active certificates. We have an average partnership of over 10 years, which when you consider the certification cycle is 3 years, you can see that there is a high retention of our clients. And this is also backed up by our Net Promoter Score, which is a metric calculating the likelihood that a customer would recommend a company product to a colleague or friend. The range is between -100 and +100, and NQA are sat currently at 72, which is the highest within our industry. Our core standards in the UK are the big three, the 9001, 14001 and the 45001. However, given the recent pandemic, we have seen a large increase in 27001, which is information security. Obviously, with more and more people working from home, information security has become high in importance. Also, PAS 2060, which is a standard around carbon neutrality, obviously high on the agenda worldwide with global warming and climate change taking effect. Companies are now starting to look at how they can reduce their carbon footprint to make the world a cleaner place. This standard has picked up huge momentum, and we receive a high number of inquiries from a range of industries actually, and different size companies around how NQA can verify them to this standard. So as you can see on the infographic, in the US, we are #1 certification body in the aerospace sector with some extremely high level clients there. We're also #1 in China in the automotive sector by a long stretch. And we are the global #1 certification body in the telecoms and automotive sector. Next page, please, Frank. So yeah, the certification services and training that we offer are on the basic standards mentioned earlier. So the quality management, environmental and health and safety, as well as 50001, which is energy management, 27001, 22301, which is business continuity, which is obviously a nice follow-on from the InfoSec piece. Also 13485, which is medical devices, and IATF for automotive and aerospace standards. As mentioned earlier, actually, PAS 2060, which is an area NQA are focusing on, we are currently running monthly 2-day courses on introduction and implementation of this standard. All of our training services are available both face-to-face and online. Obviously, we've had to make all of our training online recently due to the pandemic, but we've seen a high number of successful remote training for our clients. Next page, please, Frank. So, nationwide training services for all our existing clients. We also offer completely free e-learning services. So however many employees you have in your organization you wish to upskill, we offer that for free. To be honest, even if you're not an existing client, it's really not expensive, and they're really good courses. Most of the NQA team have actually taken the courses as part of their induction. We offer in-house training as well. So if you have, let's say, 5 to 6 employees in your organization you feel would benefit from a training course, whether it be implementation or internal audit level or even lead audit level, we would arrange for one of our trainers to visit you on site to deliver the requested training. Finally, we do also have public training courses, so we run these courses in hotels across the UK. Again, this has been conducted remotely recently. However, this year we are getting back to providing in person. And any further information that you may wish to look at is on the training courses are available on the NQA website. Next page, please, Frank. So that is NQA in a nutshell. Thank you for listening to me. As promised, I'm now going to hand you over to Frank Reynolds, who's from QSE Ltd, and he's going to discuss the risk-based approach to supplier management. So over to you, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Henry, and very good afternoon to everyone, and a warm welcome to our webinar on topic of supplier or vendor management, a risk-based approach. Before we go into the objectives of this course, this session rather, I'd like to give some background to my experience of some training many years ago, some 20 years ago, when I found myself a quality manager purely by accident. I had no idea what quality assurance was, what ISO 9001 was, so I went to a training course that was delivered by one of the national certification companies. And I came out of that course knowing less than when I went in. Confusion reigned. So my main objective for this webinar is that you get an idea of what supplier management, vendor management is all about and how we do that. That's my main objective of this course. But during this webinar, I'll be explaining what vendor management is and how it's relative to the standards, how it relates to the standards, why we take a risk-based approach, and we'll be giving you an idea of how you can judge, evaluate, assess your vendors using risk. And we'll be looking at some controls that you can put in place for that. Now, what I'm going to do to start with is going to go right back to the standard, and not to the normal clauses in the standard, but rather to the introduction. The introduction to ISO 9001 is a much overlooked part of the standard. It gives us some context and background to the standard that's useful. And one of the most useful things it gives to us is the quality principles. So there are 7 quality principles. And these principles are the basis upon which is built our quality management systems. So to start with, we're going to look at the process approach. So what does process approach mean? Well, every company will have a main process that runs throughout the business. And this main process will probably be made up of many sub-processes. So if we think about what starts the main process, it's likely to be a customer inquiry. That customer inquiry can come in via a phone call, an email, web portal. There may be an invitation to tender, but somehow the customer will let you know that it's interested in purchasing your services or products. And then something happens where that inquiry is converted into an order. That order may have to be scheduled. The scheduler may have to look for raw materials, and so it goes on. But we come to the end of this process when we hand over to our customer the thing that they have asked for, and the thing that they've asked for is delivered on time at the price we've promised and at the spec they've asked for also. And all these processes fit together. These sub-processes fit together in our main process, and these can be, well, let's look at raw materials. If you think about raw materials coming into us, do they need to be kept at a certain temperature or a certain humidity? Do they have a shelf life? Do we have to do quality checks when they come in? So there's a whole sub-process going on there. Do you have a production line? What's required to keep this production line functioning? Do you need maintenance? Do you need engineers? Cleaning? What goes on there? So again, there's another process or sub-process going on there. Do your staff require specialist skills or training? Again, a sub-process going on there. You can see the same about change. If your customer changes their requirements halfway through production, how is that change communicated? How do you manage that change? Once you've made your product, how does it then get to the customer? Again, does your product have to be chilled? Does it have to be kept warm? Well, these are all things you need to think about, and there's another sub-process going on there. And finally, here as an example, at every stage of your main process, what quality controls are required to make sure that you meet the requirements before it goes to the next stage. So we have this one big process, but in actual fact, this is made up of sub-processes. And as the illustration there is, these are really cogs in the wheels of your business. So if we move on from process approach, thinking about all the processes that are involved, the standard then requires us to think about risk-based thinking. And again, the introduction brings in this notion of risk-based thinking. Then if we go to 6.1, the clause that tells us to think about actions to address risks and opportunities. Again, it wants us to address the risk. And another part of the standard that we tend to overlook is the annexes. And Annex 4 here, again, gives us more information about what we want, what the standard wants us to do, clarifies this whole notion of risk-based thinking. Now, risk-based thinking has always been part of quality management, but it wasn't explicitly called risk until the 2015 version. Previously, we were required to take preventive action, look at processes, see what could go wrong, and take action to prevent it going wrong. For some reason, there was a lot of confusion around preventive action, and in many companies, rather than being what you do to prevent something going wrong, it was interpreted as what you do to prevent something going wrong again. But this is actually corrective action. So risk-based thinking is not a new concept to quality management, but it is a new way of phrasing this approach. And just to be clear, the standard does not say that we have to do a risk assessment. You have to apply risk-based thinking, but this is not necessarily a risk assessment. So what we need to do now is bring this process approach and this risk-based thinking together. What does that mean? Well, this means we have to look at all of our processes. These are just examples we have here, and ask, what can go wrong? How can this process fail? What can we do to minimize the risk of this failure? And when you think about it, this is really the essence of ISO 9001. Most of the clauses are about identifying risks in the various processes and taking appropriate measures to minimize that risk. So as an example, if you think about calibration of measuring equipment, we calibrate measuring equipment because there's a risk that it won't be accurate. If there was no risk, we wouldn't calibrate it. So regardless of what business we're in, all of our quality checks are there because there is some kind of risk of failure. If there's no risk of failure, then obviously we don't need controls in place. That's what quality management's about. And so what happens if something goes wrong? The danger is that if one of these sub-process fails, that cog in the machine could stop the whole machine. And that failure could mean that we don't actually meet our customers' requirements. And that's what we're going to look at now. So back to the standard. And 8.4 in the standard talks about the control of externally provided processes, products, and services. And this is me paraphrasing the standard here for brevity's sake. But 8.4.1, the general paragraph there, says something along the lines of your company will ensure that any part of your process that is carried out by a third party is properly controlled to ensure that the risk of failure is minimized. Now, bearing in mind that the standard has been written so that it can fit most companies on the planet, the standard doesn't know what controls you need. The standard says you need to define the controls necessary to ensure the risk of failure from third parties is minimized. It also goes on to say that you must make sure that you have full and comprehensive lines of communication with these third parties, as if they were your own, to make sure that there is no room for error, so that risk, again, is minimised. Going back to the Annex, Annex 8, right to the back of the standard, gives us more information, again, a bit more clarity about what it's talking about when it mentions externally provided processes, products, and services. So if any part of your process requires an input from a third party, such as purchasing from a supplier, arrangement with an associate company, outsourcing processes to an external provider, then this becomes a supplier or is covered by 8.4. Because all of these businesses have a hand in determining whether you can meet your customer requirements or not. And of course, again, because the standard doesn't know what your business is, it says that controls required can vary, because the risk will vary and the standard doesn't know what your business is. So we've applied risk-based thinking to determine what controls are required and to externally provided processes, products, and services. Now, what we're going to do here is look at an illustration of a very good, iconic illustration, perhaps, of a failure of externally provided processes, products, and services. Now, I'm, of course, talking about the great chicken drought of 2018. So you'll probably remember that KFC had to shut down most, if not all, of their outlets in 2018 because they ran out of chicken. Now, I think we can agree that there was a lot of reputational damage done as a result of this. It hit the headlines not just nationally, but internationally. And of course, there would have been a hit to revenue, so nothing to sell. And there was also a resulting massive amount of waste as the chicken meat had to be disposed of. But this is an interesting illustration of risk management. And it's probably worthwhile you Googling this at some point to get the full background here, because it is quite an interesting case. KFC decided that they would move from a distributor that operated out of 5 distribution hubs to a distributor that operated out of 1 distribution hub. Now, I don't know the details of this, but I suspect that somebody saw economies of scale, and operating out of 1 hub made much more sense than operating out of 5, which was more expensive. However, once they transferred to their 1 distribution hub, there was a conspiracy of circumstances and, tragically, a fatal road accident just outside the distribution hub. This caused the roads round about them to be closed for days while the police investigated, and this in turn meant that suppliers couldn't bring the chicken meat to the hub and it couldn't leave the hub to go to the outlets. This wasn't KFC's first brush with supplier issues, because not so very long before that, all their card machines in their outlets went down and they couldn't take payment by card. They could only take payment by cash. So again, big financial hit, big reputational damage, and these are exactly the sort of things that we're looking to avoid when we talk about managing our suppliers and managing our vendors. So I want to talk about, very briefly, about vendors. Now, vendors is purely a generic term to cover suppliers, associated companies, external providers, contractors, subcontractors. It's shorthand for that. Yeah? This is for anybody who has a hand in our process and can affect the outcome and our delivering. What we say we're going to deliver to our customer. So there's really not about contractor. In my experience, this is an area where I've seen some confusion about it. And so obviously we have our customer. Customer has a contract, and they will contract somebody to carry out that work. This contractor may be able to fulfill the contract on their own, or they may need to use other companies, other businesses to fulfill the contract. And it's these other businesses that become the subcontractors. As far as the client is concerned, the client wants to know that all of these parties, as far as they're concerned, are vendors. All of these parties can present a risk to the job being completed on time, on budget, on spec. And that's why we look at vendor management. So it really doesn't matter what you call them. It doesn't matter whether we call them contractors, vendors, suppliers. We're calling them vendor for shorthand. But what's important in your organisation is that they are defined to different. So clearly, bad management of vendors can lead to, in the first instance, not meeting our clients' or customer requirements. And obviously that can lead to a loss of finance. We can lose money in that. But down that trail, that can also lead to accidents, environmental incidents. If you're in a business where the job can be stopped for safety concerns, that can be an issue. If you can get a fine by regulators or fines from clients, if your vendor messes up machinery that you've got to replace, if vendors disappear and you've got to replace personnel, got to do that, you may see an increase in near misses and maybe reputational damage, a loss of the contract, or even a loss of repeat business. And these are just some examples. You'll have a much better idea of how bad management of vendors can affect you. But these are just some examples. So the next stage we have to think about is, where do we start? How do we identify the vendors? Well, really what we have to do is look at all our processes. All the processes that are within our quality management system, look in there and see exactly what third parties, what suppliers, what external processes, we're calling them vendors, what their input is to our processes, and write a list. And then once we have our list, we need to look at these vendors and say, well, how can they fail? And if they fail, how does that affect us? So this is an exercise that organizations and companies have to go through to identify how vendors fail and how that will affect you. Now, this can be a long process or a short process. It really depends how many vendors you have and what kind of risk they carry. So this could be anything from, can the vendor, will they deliver late? What happens if they deliver the wrong size, the wrong number, the wrong part? You need to look and see where this failure might be and how it will affect you. So once we have our list of vendors, we can start thinking about perhaps giving them a level, a risk level. How risky are they? So let's go back to KFC. Yeah. And let's think about the vendor that supplies KFC with paper drinks cups. So if the vendor fails, what's the severity? What's the impact on us? Well, if the paper cups vendor fails, probably we can nip out to the nearest cash and carry and buy paper cups. We're going to see. But as we've seen with the chicken distributor, that had a massive impact on us. Reputational damage, loss of finance, all sorts of knock-on effects to there. So we would say here that there's a high severity factor here. And so perhaps the next thing we want to look at is the probability. And so, well, what's the probability of this happening? It's a low probability or a high probability? Now, I don't know. You need to determine in your industry, in your business, what the probability is of your vendors failing. You have to use your experience to do this. I really can't help you in this. But this is starting to look suspiciously like a risk assessment. Because if we use this method, well, then we can say that those vendors where there's a high probability of a high severity incident happening, we're going to call them level 1. That's our highest level of risk. If it's a high and a low, then we can call them level 2. And if it's two lows, we can call them level 3. Now remember, I said that the standard doesn't say we have to do a risk assessment, but by the same token, the standard doesn't say we can't do a risk assessment. Many of you will already be using this methodology in your businesses as it stands for safety purposes. So it may be worth looking at whether that methodology can be applied to vendors. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. Again, I don't know. You need to look at the processes you use for assessing risk and see if it can be adapted in some way. My feeling is if you can avoid reinventing the wheel, well, let's do that. Okay. When we're looking at the risk, they're only indications. So we've got to be very clear that this is not an exact science, and we've got to be very broad in our approach to looking at risk. So we need to take factors into account, such as the geographical location of the vendor. So for example, do you import from China? What could possibly go wrong? If your order from China does not meet your quality control checks, for example, how long will it take you to get the order reworked or resent? Will that affect your production schedules? No. You have to think about all of these issues. I did some work with a company who decided to send all their production to China and only have an assembly unit here in the UK. And everything went horribly wrong. They got all sorts of quality issues with the parts that were coming over for assembly, and in the end they had to remove the manufacturing unit from China, re-established in the UK, because the distance was just too great, causing too many problems. We need to look at political circumstances. Who knows what's going on just now if you have suppliers in Northern Ireland? So these can be important. There can be strikes, Brexits going on as well. These are all things that you need to take into account when you're thinking about the risks presented by your suppliers. What about the market? Do you require anything that's scarce? Now, one of the big issues just now for many companies is labour. Labour is scarce. And we can go back to political circumstances, and we can perhaps go back to geographical things as well, because COVID hasn't helped, Brexit hasn't helped, but there is a scarcity of labour in the market. How will that affect your processes? Look at the market. Is there a big pool for your suppliers, or is it a small pool? The likelihood is if there's a big pool of your suppliers, the risk is lessened. If it's a small pool, there's a greater risk because you have less options if something goes wrong. So these are all things that we need to consider when we're thinking about the risk presented to our vendors. Okay, And just now we'll look very briefly at some examples of supply chain squeezes just now that are going on or have been recent. These are only some. If you work in construction, materials are hard to come by, and so on and so on. So there's all sorts of supply chain squeezes, which has a knock-on effect. These are all risks that you have to look at. So let's say that we've used the matrix there, and using that matrix, we've been able to give our vendors a risk level. We've been able to assign a risk level to them based on the risk they present to us. Now, this is a very simple example. And for our purposes, I'm going to say that level 3 doesn't require any controls, so that we can let them go. An example of level 3 perhaps would be if you require lubricating oil for a process and your supplier fails, but you can nip out to the nearest garage and buy some lube oil that will do the job, then the risk to you, the risk of your process failing because your vendor has failed, is low. If, however, you need a specialist food-grade lubricating oil from a specialist supplier that isn't easy to come by, clearly the risk then is higher. So that's how we're looking at risk. So for level 1 and 2, we've identified the risks that are presented by our vendors. So the next thing we need to do is think about checking with the vendors about what arrangements they have in place to manage these risks. So we need to communicate with the vendors or potential vendors to see how they manage the risks that we have identified that could have an impact on us. So one of the ways that this is done, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, either by sending out questionnaires yourself or getting questionnaires from potential customers and clients, is a questionnaire goes out and asks for certain control, evidence of controls, evidence that you've identified your risks and evidence that you've controlled your risks. This is what we're sending out to the suppliers. They may send evidence back, which can be anything, procedures, maintenance plans, document record controls, etc. So once you have these back, you then have to determine whether these measures are satisfactory, whether the risk has been minimised, and you also need to consider whether the mitigation is appropriate. So if something does go wrong, what's the recovery plan? How long will it take for the vendor to recover from the problem they've had, and how will that affect us? You can also look at things like their policies. Are their policies consistent with ours? Policies tend to be consistent with each other because, quite honestly, in my experience, there was an Adam and Eve of policies. In my experience, they've been copied and pasted through the generations. So you can only get limited value from checking policy statements. So let's look at how we might put this process into action. So again, thinking about level 1 and 2, we've identified the risks presented by the vendor groups. We're going to send out a questionnaire. And again, I want to emphasize that this questionnaire should be designed to address the risks. There's no point sending out a questionnaire that asks somebody what their favourite colour is if it doesn't give you information that you can use to evaluate their usefulness to you and the risk they present to you. You need to be very specific about what you ask them. This is all linked together. once the questionnaires have been returned, you'll have a much better understanding of how your vendors manage the risk. When I first started as a quality manager, a pressed man, I have to say, I knew, because our procedure said that I had to send out questionnaires to all our suppliers, so I did that. They sent them back, and they were beautifully filed away on the shelf behind me. Now, absolutely no use to anybody. That was a tick box exercise. The standard says we have to do this. Let's go through this process that nobody cares about and is no use to anybody. Yeah. If you're going to do that, just don't. It's a waste of time. You must make sure that your questionnaires address the risks that you've identified are a danger to your company. So then moving on from that, you can see, is the response satisfactory? Are you happy with the response you've received? So let's look at level 2 and let's say, yes, we're happy with the response we've received from our level 2 vendors, and so they can go on our approved vendor list. Now, level 1, we've received a satisfactory response, but because they're level 1, because the risk is that much higher to us, we're actually going to do an audit on them. We're going to visit their site, we're going to check through their procedures, we're going to look for evidence, we're going to make sure the risk to us is minimised. And then if that audit is satisfactory, then they can go on the approved vendor list. Now, I want to emphasise that this is a much simplified process to illustrate the principle here. In some companies, this may be enough. If your organisation is quite a simple processes, this may be enough. It's likely that you'll need a much more complex process to manage your vendors, but this should give you an idea of what can be done, one way of doing it. But make sure that your questionnaires are there to address the risk. If there's no satisfactory response, if the questionnaires aren't satisfactory, or if the audit isn't satisfactory, then we need to think about what do we do in those circumstances. So the first option, there may be more than 3 options. I'm giving us 3 here. Okay. The first option is to reject the vendor outright and to say, you don't have any controls, you don't know what a written procedure is, we can't work with you. The risk to us is too high. So you can reject the vendor outright. A second option is you can provide the controls yourself. Now, an example of this would be, I worked for a company recently that requires specialist environmental operators for its projects. So it found an agency who would supply 5 environmental specialists at the cheapest rate, very cheap rate, very good rate for us. The problem was that when the project moves to the next phase and required an additional 40 specialists, the agency couldn't find these specialists because they were paying bottom dollar for it. So unable to meet their contractual obligations, this vendor decided that the only thing they could do was then to forge certificates and start manning the project with unqualified environmental professionals. Our client found out, told us all sorts of problems, stopped the job, big investigation. Because circumstances were such, we could not use another supplier immediately. We had to continue using this vendor, but we had to check all the certificates ourselves. It was a most unsatisfactory way of doing it, but sometimes that's what you have to do. The much more likely scenario is that you say to a vendor, okay, we've looked at your questionnaire, we've done an audit, and we think you need some additional controls in there. And we're going to give you a month to do that, or we're going to give you 3 months to do that. Once you've done that, report back to us, we'll check your controls, and if everything's okay, we'll award the contract. And that's a much more common way to do it. So we've now looked at evaluating our vendors, looking at the risks, and looked at some methodology for evaluating the risk process we can go through to do that. 841 not only talks about the criteria for evaluation, but then it goes on to talk about how we monitor performance and re-evaluation. So once we've evaluated our vendors, once they're approved vendors, it doesn't stop there. We need to have a process in place so that we monitor their performance and we have a periodic re-evaluation of their performance. Now again, the standard doesn't say how often that re-evaluation should be. That would depend very much on the nature of your business. For example, it may well be that if you do project work, and at the end of the project you re-evaluate all of your vendors. It may well be that if you just have a regular production line that just churns out stuff, you might want to do annual vendors evaluations. Biennial, it's up to you, who knows. But what you need to do, you need to make sure you do this, and I will emphasize it later, is retain documented information of these activities and any necessary actions arising from these evaluations. So you have to document this whole process. And this kind of takes us back to the risk assessment. You don't need to do a risk assessment, but if you have a written methodology, it makes it much easier to produce this documented information that the standard requires. So how are we going to evaluate the performance of our vendors? Once they're approved vendors, they're working for us, how are we going to evaluate the performance? Well, I'm going to go back very briefly to the introduction of the standard again and to the quality management principles. And this time, I want us to consider evidence-based decision making. So clearly then, what we've got to do is evaluate and re-evaluate our vendors on the basis of evidence. So what kind of evidence can we use? Well, this is really, again, up to you. It depends on the nature of your business, on the nature of the vendors that you're using, the risk that they present to you, but it could be, for example, vendor non-conformances, customer complaints, late deliveries, failed quality checks. It's entirely up to you how this happens. So you need to identify what measures you're going to use to judge the performance of your vendors. You need to do that. You need to make sure that this is documented because the standard says so. Okay, now, there are nationally a number of supply chain management schemes. And what these purport to do is to make life easier for purchasing companies and for vendors by assessing the risk that's involved in the chain there. Now, one of the largest companies in the UK that does this is Achilles, and it has a number of sector schemes. So some of you may be familiar with FPAL, which is the oil and gas sector scheme, UVDB, which is the utilities sector, and the transport sector. That's linked up. I think there's more, but you get the point. Now, what Achilles do, and all these schemes do, they all do it slightly differently, but they audit vendors and potential vendors against a checklist and give them a score. And then that score can be used by the purchasing companies as they see fit. Okay. I was an FPAL auditor for a number of years. And I'll give you an example of the spectrum that's covered here. So I audited Babcock, the shipbuilder that runs Forsyth Naval Dockyard just across the water from me here, when they were building HMS Queen Elizabeth, the aircraft carrier. So clearly a massive, complex organisation, thousands of people involved, hundreds of subcontractors involved. So a big organisation going on there. Now I also audited a company in Aberdeenshire that was a specialist agency that supplied project managers to oil and gas. This company, this agency, had 3 employees and worked out of a 2-room office near Aberdeen. I used the same checklist for both companies, and I had the same amount of time to audit both companies. So clearly, I would suggest that there's a danger that if you do that, if you use this one-size-fits-all checklist or questionnaire, you fit nobody. So again, I want to re-emphasize, make your questionnaires, if you're going to use questionnaires, make your questionnaires work for you. Yeah? It's not really rocket salad, is it? So there are, of course, other things that you might want to consider. There's a whole due diligence process that the finance department may need to go through. They may need to know, is your vendor solvent? Do they have enough money to buy the supplies that they need to create the thing that you need? Are they going to go bankrupt halfway through their contract? Do they have the appropriate insurances in place? Maybe somebody should check Companies House for the returns. What's their credit score like? Do they have the appropriate licenses and permits in place? These may be important to you. They may not. You need to decide what to do about this. And then there are other considerations that come from the other standards. If we think about ISO 14001, 8.1, they have a very similar requirement to the quality standard. It's not so clunky, but it's the same thing. Do any of your vendors have significant environmental aspects? And are they being managed appropriately? Essentially, what this environmental standard is saying here, you can't outsource your environmental problems. You must still exert as much influence and control as you can to minimize the environmental risks as if it was your own. You can't say, it wasn't me, it was somebody else. You have the responsibility. And the same thing's true of ISO 45001. They have a bit of chunkier clause here, but again, it says that you need to look at, you cannot outsource safety. You can't say, well, it's a bit expensive for us to manage safety, so we're going to do something, we're going to let a vendor manage it, and we're not going to check whether their workers are safe or not. 45001 doesn't let you do that. You have to exert control all the way down that supply chain. Now, there's a very interesting question here when it comes to the environment and to safety about all the outsourcing that's been done to China and how that's managed. Fortunately, we don't have time to do that, so we'll skip over that one for the moment. But let's look now just quickly. This was the risk matrix that we looked at earlier. It's very simple, and this may or may not suit simple supply chains. But if your supply chain is particularly complex, then it's likely that you'll need to employ a much more complex tool. And this is one of these complex tools called the Kralitch matrix. Kralitch matrix. Yeah, we can't go into this in detail, but this has been designed to look at supply chains where there is this high level of risk. Complex supply chains, looks at market changes, all sorts of things like that. Again, if you have a complex supply chain, start looking at this, even if it's just for ideas and how you can improve your own vendor management process. And finally, There is an organisation called the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, and they can open the door to a wide range of useful resources for those who are involved in the purchasing process. This includes, there's a personal professional development plan, and there's a library of useful material. There's a cost attached to membership. Depending on your role, it may be well worth it. Okay, so I'd like to thank you for your time. That's me edging over it. So very briefly, I'm going to look at any oh, right. All right, I'm only looking at questions now. So to Tony, who's experienced a lot of echo, I'm sorry about that. I see you've left now. So Rachel says there's a lot of large corporations who will not complete the questionnaire and they can be hard to engage with. What's the best way to? I know exactly this problem. They still have to. You have to keep pushing them. Again, you need to make these decisions in-house, make management judgment about how best to deal with that. It's something I've come across, and I've come across no easy answer, and certainly nothing I can just quickly help you with there. Julie's asked about modern slavery considerations. Again, that's certainly one that should be included. You have a responsibility with regards to modern slavery. And this is the whole issue really, is that we're looking not just at quality requirements, but if you fail in a modern slavery, safety, environmental, that can become a quality issue if you get shut down. That's the thing. So anyway, folks, thank you very much for your time. That's just a bit over time and pretty much all of the questions answered. So I'm going to sign off now. Again, thank you for your time, and that's it. Goodbye.